Today, I'll be listing the top 10 greatest death metal bands of all time. So last time, I listed the top 10 greatest death metal albums of all time, and in that video I asked you guys what you thought were the greatest death metal bands of all time. The rules are the same as the last video. The number of mentions counts as votes for a band to be included or not in the list. And a lot of you guys mentioned one-off bands, like pretty much most of you mentioned like your favorite band and then some old school band. And again, this is a list that was made by you guys. I just gathered the information, so if you don't agree with this list, fight amongst each other. I'm exempt from all that responsibility. And since many of you guys mentioned a lot of one-off bands, the mentions are a lot more sparse in this video, but I was still able to make a cohesive list. So with that out of the way, let's just jump right into the list. At number 10 with 8 mentions, it's Gorguts. Yes? If you've been following me for a while, you might know that this is one of my favorite bands of all time, not just in death metal, but in music in general. Formed in Sherbrooke, Quebec in Canada in the late 80s, they started with what is now their highly regarded demo And Then Comes Lividity, which was released in 1990. And in the following years, they released their first 2 studio albums, those being Considered Death in 91, which is very much just straightforward death metal of that time in the style of Malevolent Creation and Deicide, and Erosion of Sanity in 93, which is described by Luc Lemay, their sole remaining founding member and main songwriter, as their tech death album. And these 2 albums went by kinda unnoticed at the time, but are now considered cult classics. But then years later, in 1998, they released the album that sold me onto them, which is Obscura, which to me is the earliest example of what we would call avant-garde death metal. This album almost has a free jazz approach to its composition, with the unorthodox way of playing riffs and the little details they incorporated into it. Several years after they disbanded and then they regrouped in the early 2000s with a new lineup, they released some more material and play a bunch more live, and then they went on to release in 2013 what is now one of my favorite death metal albums of all time, that being Color Sands, which again is a very avant-garde kind of album, but this one has a more classical approach to its composition, using a lot of counterpoints in the riffs, which a lot of times it makes so that both the guitars and the bass are playing completely different things at the same time. This album goes from being brutal and hitting you really hard to being almost meditative even. If it seems like I'm spending a lot of time talking about this band, it's because I am. I love this band and I'm so glad they made it onto the list. I might have put them a little bit higher, but oh well. At number 9 with 9 mentions, we have a tie of 2 very important bands. The first one of which is Obituary, one of the earliest and most fundamental bands to the style. They are the definitive caveman death metal band, being focused on sounding groovy and thick. It just makes sense that they are here. The other band on this spot is Cryptopsy. On the Greatest Death Metal Albums video, they were at number 2 with None So Vile, and now they made it onto the list again, and rightfully so. They released some of the most brutal albums of all time, like Blasphemy Made Flesh, None So Vile, and Once Was Not. Probably the fastest playing band at the time they came out, and they definitely had a hand on raising the bar in terms of speed and brutality. They were my favorite band in middle school, and I still listen to them very often. Heck, I think the last time I listened to them was yesterday or maybe this morning. So number 8 with 10 mentions is Suffocation, and in my opinion, they're a little low on this list. Pioneers of brutal and technical death metal, prime example of the sound of New York in this style, and a band with one of the most solid discographies out there. Some of their albums are stronger than others, but I wouldn't say they have a single bad album. Their discography ranges from above solid to mandatory listen to any fan of this kind of music. I just saw them live for the first time this past September, and even though they had a lot of changes to their lineup, they are still incredibly tight and very well deserving of being considered one of the greatest of all time. At number 7 with 11 mentions, it's Carcass, formed in the mid-80s in Liverpool. You know, like the store. Being pioneers of grindcore or gore grind, of gore metal if you choose to call it that. Then aside from their grind sound, they incorporated a style of death metal some people call death and roll, then playing melodic death metal before the rising tide of Gothenburg bands in Sweden. It's no surprise why so many people mention them. Carcass reinvented themselves pretty much with every album they released up until their disbandment in 1986, and then continued playing their style of melodic death metal when they got back in 2007. They were one of the first bands to ever introduce me to blast beats, and we wouldn't have a lot of great modern death metal bands like Hell Decapitation and the Black Dahlia Murder if it wasn't for them. Now, at number 6 with 15 mentions, it's Immolation. From Yonkers, New York, this is another one of my favorite death metal bands of all time. So, in the early to mid 90s, the two major American death metal scenes at the time, as many of you know, were from Florida and New York. Suffocation represented the main sound and themes of New York death metal, that being sounding more percussive and focused on brutality in comparison to the sound of Florida. Now, Immolation is a good representation of the other side of New York death metal, that being the unholy bands. Bands like Incantation that sounded still pretty brutal, but had a much darker, more evil sound. This kind of bands ended up having a lot more in common with those from the New Jersey scene of death metal in later years, with acts such as Funebrarum and Disma that came after them. However, Immolation had a very particular sound in comparison to these other bands, mainly because of the writing style of their founding guitar player Bob Bigna, one of my favorite death metal guitarists of all time. The word that I often use to describe this style is out there. He's very much one to think outside the box when it comes to writing riffs and making them fit into songs, sometimes in a way that it's almost unnoticeable until you analyze it with a fine-tooth comb. Then you can see how sometimes the riffs don't just fall into a grid properly, and it might lead you to believe that they're playing in odd time signatures, but a lot of the times that's just the way they write riffs. Sometimes seemingly deliver it, but most of the time feeling like that's just the way that they naturally approach making music in general. And that, it's a whole lot of words just to say that this band is really cool and that I like them a lot. Also, kinda surprised that they made it this high up on the list. Not complaining though, they could be higher for all I care. Next, at number 5, with 16 mentions, is Deicide. One of the most influential bands in death metal, and of course being from Tampa, Florida, are considered one of the big 4 of death metal, or maybe just American death metal, sometimes fighting for their spot with Obituary. At the time they came out, they were definitely one of the most brutal bands out there. In 1990, there were not many albums as brutal as their first self-titled album, especially with the production level that it had in comparison to most of their peers back then. And in 1992, they just reaffirmed themselves as serious business with the release of their second album, Legion, which was more technical and even more frenetic sounding than their previous album. They kinda got too comfortable with their sound with the release of their next 2 albums, in 95 with Once Upon the Cross, and in 97 with Surface of the Light, both of which pretty much represent the sound that they will be working on all of their albums after. Some people were upset that none of the best Deicide albums made it to the main list last time, so I hope you're happy that they made it to the top 5 now. And at number 4 with 19 mentions, it's Bolt Thrower. Pretty much the only British band on this list besides Carcass. I have a certain level of respect for them getting their name from a weapon off of one of the nerdiest tabletop games of all time, that being Warhammer, and you know I'm all about the nerdy crap. They formed in 1986 as a grindcore band of all things, which kinda makes sense for the time and place they came out of. But by 88, they settled for the groovy kind of death metal that they went on to be known for when they released their debut album, In Battle There Is No Law. To be honest, I don't really agree with this placement. I mean, if you want to have Bolt Thrower on the list, by all means. But on the top 5, it's a little high for me. I might have them switch places with Suffocation, but hey, I didn't make the list, I just gathered the information. Now at number 3 with 20 mentions, it's Cannibal Corpse. What? A number 3? Unbelievable! Guess you already know who number 2 and 1 are. If you're into extreme metal, Cannibal Corpse is a band that needs no introduction, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Formed in Buffalo, New York, and then moved base to Tampa, Florida, because that's what you do when you're a death metal band in the early 90s in America. If Carcass was the band that popularized talking about gore in songs as a whole, Cannibal Corpse might be the band that popularized this more Fulci-style horror movie approach to songs instead of having to whip out the medical dictionary for every song. And if you feel like tearing me open a new one because I missed the 347 random demos of the underground bands that actually popularized the gore theme, go off I guess, but I don't really care. We're approaching the end of the list. At number 2 with 23 mentions, it's Morbid Angel. I wonder who's the number 1? Another band from Tampa, Florida. What a surprise! one of the main pioneering bands of the genre being formed as early as they did. It's a band that is never let out of a discussion of how death metal came to be. They're responsible for setting the standard for many of the defining characteristics of this genre, like the ferocious guitar riffs, the heavy use of blast beats and double kick grooves, and the wild guitar solos, especially with a lot of whammy bar usage. Just so many bands take influence from Morbid Angel to this day, whether they realize it or not including them will be sacrilege. Now before we get to number 1, I want to do some honorable mentions of bands that just didn't make it to the list in terms of mentions, but are still very important. Entombed and Dismember, which were responsible for setting the template of the Stockholm sound of death metal in Sweden. Autopsy, which had a slower, much filthier sound than a lot of the earlier bands that were more thrash influence. And they're considered one of the main pioneering bands of this genre, being cited so frequently as an influence by a lot of important bands such as the previously mentioned Entombed and Dismember, along with bands previously mentioned on this list such as Immolation, Cannibal Corpse, and Deicide, in addition to having helped pioneer the style of death doom. Nile and Necrophagist being two of the most influential technical death metal bands of all time. Nile being on the more brutal side of things, taking influence on the writing style of brutal death metal bands, using technique to overwhelm you in density, and Necrophagist being on the more precise and flashy side of this particular style of death metal. Being so inspired by Baroque music, they still continued to influence the modern technical death metal movement with their 2004 album Epitaph. Incantation, which like Immolation is part of the unholy side of bands from New York's death metal scene, but with a more straightforward style to their composition in comparison to Immolation. And they're the main influence of a lot of those new bands of that old school death metal revival movement that have been coming out in the past few years, like Entombed and Atheist, which are regarded as the godfathers of technical death metal, but to me they always sounded more like progressive death metal with how much influence they take on early progressive rock and metal and jazz. But yeah, yet another band from Florida, who could have guessed. But now, a number 1 with 30 mentions. Oh my god, who could it be? Who could it be? It's Death. Wow. What a surprise. I bet nobody saw that coming. Pioneering death metal band, and to this day are considered one of the most influential groups, not just in death metal, but in heavy metal as a whole. Their debut album, Scream Bloody Gore from 1987, is widely regarded as the first death metal album ever, and their frontman Chuck Schuldiner was regarded as one of the prime instigators of the death metal movements. All attributions that Chuck himself dismissed because that was the kind of low-key guy that he was. There's a big leap in mentions between the first and second spot on this list because pretty much everyone was mentioning their favorite band and then they were like, oh, and Death too, I guess. So yeah, those were the 10 greatest death metal bands of all time according to you. Let me know if you agree with this list or if you have a different list. Leave it in the comments down below or reply to the pinned comment on this video with your list. Also, for those of you who like numbers, bam! Pie chart.
That's it. I'm calling my lawyers. Jojo plays music. What's that even supposed to mean? Music.
I've been having a lot of fun doing this different kind of videos in which I can talk and just do something different than playing riffs, which I still love doing. Let me know in the comments down below what kind of videos would you like to watch in this particular format. I want to spice my channel a little bit. So if you like this video, please hit the like button down below, and if you're not subscribed, what are you doing? Go ahead and subscribe already. If you're already subscribed, make sure you click that notifications bell so you never miss a new video. If you really like my videos, you can support me on my Patreon, which will be linked in the description of this video down below. Any help I can get goes a long way for me being able to continue making these videos and being able to improve them. All my social media links and my Discord server will be linked down below, so please go check them out. My channel was recently hacked, so I suggest you follow me on those sites so whenever something happens, hopefully not as drastic as this, you'll be notified through my social media profiles. So that is all. I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.